Good afternoon, and welcome to our fifth session, What Becomes of the Global Economy and Globalization, featuring Professor Dani Rodrik of the Harvard Kennedy School. Our moderator is HBS Professor and Senior Associate Dean, Rodrik-Spar. Please note that a recording of this session will be made available to a broader public audience. If during Q&A you're called on to pose a question, your name and voice will be part of that recording. When we get to Q&A, we'll ask you to signify an interest in asking a question by using the raise hand function. We're also going to invite you to use the chat function to either have another mechanism for asking a question or for reacting to the conversation that's unfolding. Handing it over to you, Deb.
Great, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon, and particularly to welcome Dani Rodrik, albeit virtually, to the Harvard Business School. Donny, as you heard, is one of the leading economists of globalization writing today. He and I first crossed paths many, many years ago when I was a graduate student and he was a young professor. And we shared a mentor in the person of Ray Vernon, who was one of the great scholars of both Harvard Kennedy School and Harvard Business School, and really one of the first people to study globalization as a phenomenon. And Donny has gone on very much to follow in Ray's footsteps and to become one of the most insightful scholars and people who are willing to critique the global economy. Donny's work has been both controversial and wildly heralded. And so it's a pleasure to bring him here today. So Donny, let me start by setting the stage. A lot of your work is deeply rooted not only in economics, but in economic history. Unlike many other economists, you tend to see economic developments as embedded in and affected by the context in which they occur. So what is your sense at this admittedly very early moment of how the coronavirus will eventually play out? Is the virus going to push the global economy to a major inflection point, or do you believe that we will, after some period of time, pretty much return to business as usual?
Thank you, Deborah. It's good to see you and to join virtually this session. I'm very happy you brought up Ray Vernon's name. Ray is not only the person who put us in touch, but he's also the person who first made me cross the river to spend time at the business school when he was on the faculty, and I was one of his undergraduate research assistants. Ray and Ray's work, of course, is terribly relevant to all these discussions. Probably his best book was this book called Sovereignty at Bay. Remember that? And that was published in 1971.
And it was right.
It was about globalization. And I think you can read that book, and many of those insights are still extremely relevant. So that's a kind of, I think, an apt introduction also to the question you're asking is that globalization has a history. And it goes all the way back to, I think, not just the late 19th century with gold standard, but as even beyond that, you can go through history and study. In fact, we're talking today about how our coronavirus is the product of globalization and how it has made countries more interdependent. But of course, the Black Death was also the plague that came from Asia and traveled through the trade routes to Europe. It took a little bit longer then than it takes today, but it's still very much the same kind of phenomenon. So I think one very important thing that I've learned about looking at globalization from a historical angle is that there's not just one globalization. There are very many different globalizations, and they don't fall onto our laps from the sky. We actually design those globalizations. Every global economic system relies on a certain rules that are either written down. For example, today they're written down in trade agreements of the WTO or the Articles of Agreement of the IMF, or in Europe it's the Acquis Communautaire with nearly 200,000 pages of regulations. So it's all written down and we're making choices. Or sometimes it's rules that are internalized in the behavior of policymakers because they say, this is what responsible policymakers do. This is how they act. And they internalize certain ways of behavior that's consistent with that particular model of globalization. I think the kind of globalization that we moved into sometime into the 1990s is a model that I've called hyperglobalization, and I gave it a name. I thought that we needed to give it a name because I thought it was very different from the globalization that we had before 1990s. There was a system that was sort of associated with the Bretton Woods Agreement, sometimes called the Bretton Woods-GATT regime, but roughly between sort of the end of the Second World War through the 1980s, and the 80s were a period of transition. I think the hyperglobalization was very different from the pre-hyperglobalization period.
I'm sorry, Donny, to interrupt. I'm just getting a note that your voice is a little bit quiet. So if you could just make it a little louder, that'd be great. Thanks.
I can try, and I can also try to speak a little bit closer to my
That sounds
laptop.
good.
Okay.
Thanks.
And I think the hyperglobalization, I think, was distinguished from the earlier stage of globalization in a number of critical respects. I think it went much deeper in terms of its ambitions, in terms of how closely to entangle different countries' economies together. So we moved to what often economists call a model of deep integration from shallow integration. So we had much more expensive trade agreements that dealt not only with import tariffs or quotas at the border, but also health systems or with public regulations, with intellectual property rights, with investment rules. Trade agreements became much more invasive in a way. And also we moved critically into an area where financial globalization, the free flow of finance, became a norm rather than the exception. It was a critical difference. And I think the total effect of these was, to put it to caricature somewhat, but not, I think it's still meaningful. Then we moved to a kind of globalization where national economies were supposed to function in the service of the world economy, rather than the other way around, rather than the world economy being in the service of national economies. Of course, there were lots of beneficiaries of the system. Large corporations, big bank, big pharma benefited, but created a lot of strains. So, and these strains were already resulting in a kind of a fraying of the system. So without question, in this moment of crisis, we are seeing very big decline in world trade. Without question, the decline in world trade and cross-border financial flows will be much bigger than the decline in world output and GDP. But I think that's sort of the weakening of the underlying set of rules and practices really predate the coronavirus. And we see it in a number of different dimensions. We see that global value chains already weren't expanding nearly as rapidly. Actually, cross-border finance never really recovered from the 2008-9 crisis. And we see it, of course, in the political backlash, and trade tensions having risen significantly between U.S. and China, but also globally more so. So there were things that were already happening that made it quite clear that we were in an unsustainable course, and it wasn't quite clear what's going to happen. So I don't see as much an inflection point as a kind of a more a kind of reinforcement once we're out of this crisis, than a reinforcement of these existing trends.
So I want to come back to sort of these trends, but before I do that, I want to turn to something a little bit different. But some of your work has also addressed issues of economic inequality, both inequality between countries and economic inequality within countries, sometimes exacerbated by this hyperglobalization that you were just describing. So once again, do you think that this current moment is going to exacerbate the divide between the rich and the poor, or is it perhaps some kind of a wake-up call about the extent to which the elites of the world, and I think you and I would both count ourselves among those, are deeply dependent on the low-wage workers who are providing the food and the delivery and all of these other things that have until now been kind of invisible within the global system?
Well, I think most elites had heard the wake-up call once again before the crisis. I mean, I don't need to tell you or your students about the kind of soul searching that's been taking place among corporate elites in terms of thinking about corporate social responsibility, the economic and social governance kinds of rules, and how to be more responsible and responsive citizens. And I think that shows that there was that corporations realized that there was something that they needed to be, in the absence of sufficiently active government response. So I think, I fault, my side of the river for essentially having thrown the problem on the laps of corporations and saying that you deal with this because we are unable to come up with tax regimes or regulations or labor markets that are producing the kinds of desirable, more inclusive economic arrangements. So you corporations, you deal with it. So that was, that's definitely, that was already happening. I think you mentioned inequality. I think the fundamental issue, as I see it right now, is less inequality per se than the kind of the disappearance of good and secure jobs. So it's much more a problem of the middle classes and the lower middle classes than the problem of at the very bottom. Now, it's absolutely true that in the United States, it's both. In the United States, it's both a squeezing of the middle class and a great increase in inequality since the 1980s. But if you look at Europe, I mean, take a country like France, where we've had some of the yellow vests and the kind of the rise of the National Front, the authoritarian rights. Inequality really hasn't increased significantly in France, certainly not compared to the United States. But what has increased is a sense of economic insecurity, that sort of good jobs are becoming scarcer, and that there's a much bigger sort of gap between the middle and the elites. Societies being divided not just economically, but also socially, culturally, cognitively, between a set of elites that are perfectly comfortable in a global world, that whose services are in demand, whose networks are global, who have the assets and the knowledge to prosper with these new technologies in this new global economy, and sort of middle classes that are increasingly feeling sort of bound to their local communities, don't have the same opportunities. And then feeling that these elites are basically simply telling them that, look, you have to get on with it, just learn to live with it, get trained, get the skills, and that's I think is where a lot of the backlash is coming from, and the crisis again sort of makes this so obvious. I mean, between those of us who are beneficiaries of this technology and are now can keep on doing what we're doing over Zoom. And service workers, or who are who don't necessarily have this kind of ability. So it's just building into this divide. So there's big alignment between the existing cleavage that predates the coronavirus and the deepening of these divisions through the crisis at the same time. Now, the big question is that's where it is. So, what comes out of this? And it's not entirely clear. Yes, there is a reckoning. Yes, there is an understanding. But you can come out of this in two ways. One is to say, look, we really need major structural changes in what we're doing. The other way is to point to the populists, to the authoritarian right, and say, see, if you don't listen to us, that's what you get. So we have to return to the status quo ante. Unfortunately, there's been too much of that second kind of response on the part of the elites. And that's where I think we're going wrong.
Okay, so I may want to come back to part of that, if we have time here. But in general, my plan is to ask sort of one more set of questions, and then at around 2:40, we will open the floor, such as it is, open to questions. So folks listening, if you want to get your questions ready, that should be in about 9 or 10 minutes from now. And we ask you, please, that you raise your hands if you have something you'd like to ask Dani. So let me turn to the policy side of this. And I think many of us recently have been recalling the famous advice that Rahm Emanuel gave to Barack Obama back in 2008 at the height of the last financial crisis, reminding him never to let a good crisis go to waste. Should we now, in this moment, when everybody's watching and everybody's worried and everybody's turning to government or any kind of authority looking for help and change, are there policies that we in the United States or we in Massachusetts or governments in any other country around the world should be putting in place? Is this the time now to do things differently? And one in particular that I'd love your thoughts on is the idea of the universal basic income, which seems to have gotten a fair amount of traction, not least because Andrew Yang has somewhat surprisingly thrown his weight behind it and gotten a lot of interest. So are there things we can do in the next 6 months, a year, to actually try and affect change?
I think there are several aspects of this. One is, does this crisis contribute to an overall changing of the narrative and the need to move into more structural changes in the policies, and therefore you have bigger support, greater political support for more radical changes, so that whether it's health policy or labor market policies or corporate governance or industrial relations, that we're willing to move into, or the wealth tax, we're willing to move into areas that we've stayed away from. The second is that you have to also bear in mind that many of the things that this is a crisis that requires very urgent response. So you need to take care of people who are being laid off, and you have to address the issues, the income support issues of a very large number of people that are finding themselves in very destitute situations. So take your example of universal basic income. I'm not a big UBI fan for reasons I'll tell you, but if right now I'd be in favor of sort of providing the most immediate income support to people that one can do. So at this point, UBI seems something that we should be in favor of. Now, the reason that I don't think UBI is the solution is UBI is a kind of is a way of resigning ourselves to the inevitability of this situation, which is really what's poisoning our economies, our societies, our politics, which is the absence of secure, good jobs. And the UBI is the answer to saying, well, technology gives us this, sort of problem, and we can't deal with it any other way, and let's just give people money. I think people, okay, I'll do amateur psychology and sociology. I think people want to lead meaningful lives, which may not mean sort of your regular 8-hour a day, 40 hours a week kind of a job. I think we can envisage flexibility, but our sense of identity, who we are, how we're contributing to society, is partly determined by the kind of jobs that we have. So I think we owe our societies this capacity to generate the kind of meaningful, secure jobs that people want to have. And that means that's where I think our interventions have to be. It's not to give people money or to redistribute after the fact. It is to engage in the kinds of industrial policies, productivist policies, industrial relations, labor market interventions, competition policies, innovation policies even, because the direction of technology, it again doesn't fall onto our lap from the sky. We decide which direction of technology that we're actually incentivizing, just like we can have more green technologies by subsidizing certain kinds of innovations. We can have more labor-friendly technologies by subsidizing or redirecting technology in a particular kind of a way. But that kind of calculus still has not entered our thinking, either at the federal level in terms of our federal innovation systems, or at the level of corporations in terms of innovation technology policy. And people think, employment or the good jobs is going to be somebody else's problem, and if not, we can always provide them with UBI anyhow. But I think that's really where the big structural changes will have to be, to think about what kind of industrial policies, what kind of innovation policies can we think of that are much more employment friendly, that deal with sort of, that technology comes in the service of society, in service of workers, rather than, telling workers that you have to, be in the service of technology and tool up and skill up. And
let me jump in there. And again, I'm sorry, I'm getting folks saying they can't hear us very well. So I will try and scream, and maybe you can. And if there's anything the tech folks can do on the volume, that would be great. But let me just throw back one quick prod, if you will. Can we writ large, really do anything to stop the march of technology? The jobs that you talk about, many of them, they are going away. And my fear is that one of the effects of this coronavirus pandemic is that we will hasten the march towards replacing humans with machines. We're all getting used to replacing human interaction in only a month with Zoom. So is it even realistic to talk about trying to bring back those jobs, given what history tells us about the march of technology, which is that it's really, really hard to reverse?
So I'm not talking about reversing the march of technology. I'm not a Luddite in any sense of the word, but I'm just saying that we do know that the direction of technology is not is something that's partly under our control. So if the let's say if our federal technology policies are in the hands of the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA. So they're going to be thinking, what kind of new technologies we will need? Oh, we actually want to reduce battlefield casualties, so let's try to encourage automated vehicles. And yeah, that's great for, from a defense standpoint, but it's not necessarily so great from an employment standpoint. But, that's not what they think about. So, you can imagine, or there are all kinds of ways in which our existing policies, we tax employment, but we subsidize capital equipment. So it's no wonder that, firms are going to invest, and from a social standpoint, overinvest in automation and in robots. But historically, I think the way that we've dealt with the problem of labor replacing technology is that we've also, as technologies increase, we also increase the range of tasks that medium-skilled people can do. So this is one of the major ways you can balance the employment. And so we can envisage putting much more effort into sort of creating technologies that's going to increase the kind of tasks that relatively less skilled or middle skilled people do. So, very in practical terms, that might mean sort of, AI technologies, for example, that enable nurses to do physicians' work, or less trained teachers to do more skilled teachers' work. So you and I can be replaced by people who don't necessarily have our education. So the institutional and legal and tax environment shapes whether we're making those decisions or not. So one reason that in the medical context that nurses can't do what physicians can do is partly because physicians prevent nurses from doing that, because they have the power and they can decide. We're the club, we decide what a physician can do. So there are all kinds of legal and institutional conditions that determine which type of technologies can develop. What I'm suggesting is that these are things that we can partly control, and we understand that our challenge is, in terms of creating more inclusive societies, is going to be to create technologies that are going to be more friendly to the middle class, that we will need to also incorporate that calculus in our decisions when we think about our innovation policies and the institutional setting in which that takes place.
Thank you. That was fabulous. So why don't we turn now to questions from the audience? So I'm going to give the controls back to Andy to call on folks. And again, people, please feel free to put your hands up if you have a question for Donny.
Thanks, Deb. Ariel, please. Ariel Yaffe, please unmute.
Hello. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand, but I guess one of my questions would be, how do you look at the introduction of technology and the long-term impacts and implications on privacy, and what that might do, to Deb's point, our economy and increasing inequality?
Thank you, Ariel, for the question. This might push me way beyond my area of expertise. Privacy is I think we recognize what the trade-offs are there, and I think especially after the present crisis, it's going to be really important to chart kind of an appropriate path between information systems that are able to help us track and trace infected individuals, while also allowing for the right to privacy and without violating anybody's human rights. I really don't have anything fundamental to say on those issues, but on inequality per se, I think I would just repeat what I just said in the last round with Deb about the need for us to think about technology as something just like globalization, as something that just doesn't come to us ready-made. That this is, we have a lot of agency in the way that we form it, but that's going to require action on a number of different levels, both at the federal level, the state and local level, and also in terms of the kinds of values that I think corporate leaders are going to internalize about in the way they think about deploying technology. One other thing I would say in relation to that is that we know that when workers have greater voice in the enterprise, that actually makes a difference to the type of technologies that are adopted and in the way in which they're adopted, in the way that they're deployed. So I think one of the changes that we actually need to consider also is sort of workers' voice in the enterprise. And I think that's beside addressing directly the questions about inequality inclusion, also has, I think, a useful indirect effect because of the influence that has on the manner in which technology gets adopted and deployed.
Adi Raghunathan, please. Please unmute. Adi? Okay, let's go to Nick Picha. Nick, please unmute. Let's try Rob Solomon, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess I'm wondering, aside from simply slowing the pace of adoption of automation or other similar technologies, can you offer specific policies that, in your mind, would address some of the problems with technology adoption that you have very helpfully illustrated?
Well, I think with respect to technology, you know, it's I mean, there is, you know, they're both correcting some of the things that are wrong, as well as doing additional things that we're not doing. So in the first category, I would say that the existing structure of R&D and tax incentives that are embedded in our national economic policies need to be reconsidered. I mean, again, our existing policies effectively amount to subsidizing automation and taxing the use of employment. That's because of, you know, various incentives to on capital depreciation and so forth, that sort of, you know, capital investment and in physical investment incentives, as well as many R&D incentives, and then our policies of taxing labor because of various charges on employment, and the way that we run our health system and so forth. So that's sort of one layer of policy, sort of national, federal level policies that would go in the direction of reducing the relative taxation of labor compared to capital. You could even envisage going sort of, you know, completely in the other direction by coming up with policies that are actually subsidizing the use of employment-friendly technology. So, for example, it's now well understood that we need to subsidize green technologies. You know, that's what's done at the federal level through ARPA-E, but there are also sort of other, you know, tax and subsidy instruments in place as well. Why not apply the same principle to technologies that actually provide precisely the kind of labor augmentation, that is, you know, give relatively less skilled workers the kinds of you know, skills with which they can do the jobs of more educated workers. And thirdly, I would say that I think probably at the most local level, I think we need state and local authorities, local development agencies, working with firms and domestic and medium-sized firms or larger investors in their localities, working with them in a kind of a, you know, iterative fashion to help them think about the consequences of different types of technology adoption, and working with community colleges, working with local community groups and the local investors to get the firms and those who are making choices with regard to technology adoption to internalize some of the social costs of not generating enough jobs or not generating good jobs. So there are sort of these different layers of policies, I think, that need to be in place. I've written about this in a couple of places. I'm happy to make those things available.
Kamal Armada, please.
Hello, thank you so much. I was just going to ask about, like, what do you think about the future of EU in the aftermath of this disease? I don't think there has been enough or like a consolidated effort, or at least not a satisfactory one. We see more and more like countries are confiscating each other's supplies, and we just had Brexit. Like, do you think this can be the thing that's going to break the EU?
Yeah, I mean, crises are never good times to test global or regional or transnational solidarity. And so I don't find it surprising that we don't have significant amount of regional or global solidarity. I think the problem with the EU is the failure to build up the kind of fiscal, political, transnational institutions to back up its economic integration. So I think sometime in the 1980s, the EU went whole hog in the direction of the single market and economic integration and culminating in single money, but without a parallel institution building on the side of fiscal and political institutions. And that's the fundamental problem of the EU, is that it is essentially an economic union that lacks the fiscal institutions, the common fiscal institutions, and correspondingly the political legitimacy of running a unified single market. And so it appears to most as a kind of a technocracy. So you have all the rules that the acquis communautaire, all the rules you need to run a single market, but those rules feel distant from ordinary people, and of course that's why you got Brexit. So I think, to put it very starkly, I think the choice that the EU faces is either it's going to have more political integration to support the economic integration that's already built, or one way or another will end up having less economic integration with a much a thinner economic integration to match the thinner political community that's been built. And I think the fundamental cause of the crisis of the EU, which periodically shows up when there are demands on these common institutions on the region, is this imbalance between how far economic integration has gone and how weak political integration is. And unless you make a decision as to whether these two will meet at an extreme point or at a relatively limited point, I think the EU is always going to get caught up in this no man's land.
Bill Ding, please.
Thank you, Professor. I have a quick question. I read your book, The Paradox of Globalization, and in the book you talk about the customizable globalization, and not all the country can achieve everything at the same time. So I'm just wondering, how do you see that going to play in the future in the area of supply chain? Because now all the government wants to diversify their supply chain, looking from the US government, from the Japanese government, from all the governments around from the world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think one way or another, I mean, we're moving into a world where I think that countries will be doing more of their own thing. So it's inevitable. And I think one thing that happens when more countries do their own thing is you get some that get it right and some that get it wrong. We look at China as a country that benefited hugely from this hyperglobalization, but it's precisely because China gave itself the freedom to do its own thing. China essentially played by the Bretton Woods rules to its own policies. It applied all the Bretton Woods rules in terms of managing its currency, controlling capital flows, deploying extensive industrial policies, while essentially it free rode on the openness policies of other countries, and that's how China did it. So we're now going to move into a world where I don't think it's going to be as hospitable. I think supply chains really were not driving economic growth in a lot of countries in the last couple of decades, and I don't think they'll be the main driver going forward. I think countries will have to focus much more on the domestic economy and on building robust middle classes, and domestic demand, I think, will play a much bigger role. In low-income countries, I think generating employment is going to be a huge issue. In low-income sub-Saharan Africa, that's the major problem. Where are you going to get the jobs to employ the people who are coming into the cities from the countryside? Manufacturing is no longer playing the role it used to be. So I think there's going to be a lot of experimentation, and I think there's going to be relatively undisciplined by international rules, because I think our international institutions are going to be much weaker in this period as we go ahead, forward, for the reasons for the trends that we've already discussed.
I think we have time for two more short ones, and then Deb will finish up. That's okay. Joachim, please, and then Zeynep. Joachim, could you unmute, please? Okay, Zeynep then, please. Zeynep Yavuz.
Okay, it just came up now, the unmute button. Okay, my question very quickly. You've touched on the international institutions. The emerging markets will be much more severely impacted economically compared to the developed world. And the answer probably lies with the IMF. We did a case this week about kind of Africa borrowing from China and how China is stepping in instead of the IMF into the African economy. So my question would be, do you think IMF will stand up for these emerging markets that can't really afford a lockdown like Turkey? Or China will be stepping in, taking the advantage of the opportunity because they're almost out of the crisis?
Yeah, I think the IMF will help some, but I think the help that countries like Turkey need goes way beyond the IMF. I mean, as you know, a country like Turkey has a lot of private debt, sort of, you know, corporates that are indebted to private banks and private bondholders. And I really do think that, you know, one of the proposals that I subscribe to is that rather than wait for sort of ad hoc defaults to happen on that debt, that international institutions like the IMF and the OECD and advanced country governments actually legitimize moratoria on public and private debt for a period of a year, at least, to give countries, not just low-income countries that got some relief just today from government bilateral creditors, but also middle-income countries, I think, need a kind of a moratorium as well. So I think what the IMF can do on top of providing financial assistance is also to legitimize such moratoria by talking about the need for it in these exceptional circumstances.
Deb, final comments?
Thank you. Well, first and most importantly, Donny, thank you. Thank you so much. This is a tough medium in which to speak, and it's just been fascinating to hear your thoughts and to see how your intellect ranges so broadly across some of these most important issues. One thing that struck me, two things struck me while you were speaking. The first is you made reference back to a book that influenced both of us, Ray Vernon's Sovereignty at Bay. And that book was really about how national governments were going to lose power over some of their most important policies. And I think as you've so beautifully described, that's played out, and governments have found themselves with far fewer tools at their disposal. I think the question that raises, though, is who has the power now? You know, if the power doesn't really sit with national governments, and as you say, international institutions seem to be in a weak period as well, kind of where has the power gone to, and how do we ensure that it goes into the right hands rather than the wrong hands? The last, much faster comment I'll make is, I think your comments give us great reason to believe that once we can all get back into the real world and we return to Cambridge, we need folks like you going across that bridge as much as possible, because it's so wonderful to get your perspective into the HBS community. So thank you so much on behalf of the school, and I hope we all can see each other again back in the real world. Thanks.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Andy, and thanks to all the participants.
Thank you, Donny, and thank you, Deb, for